In the world of Game of Thrones, few events shocked audiences as viscerally as the Red Wedding. The betrayal at the Twins not only decimated House Stark's leadership, but shattered Northern morale and paved the way for Lannister supremacy. But what if that gruesome night never occurred? What if Robb Stark, king in the North, had not been betrayed by the Freys and Boltons and instead continued his campaign? To understand how differently events might have unfolded, we must first revisit the military and political landscape Robb faced at that crucial juncture. By the time of the Red Wedding, Robb had already proven himself a masterful tactician. He had won key victories at Whispering Wood and Oxcross, taken Jaime Lannister prisoner, and earned the respect of his bannermen and the fear of the Lannisters. His cause was just, avenging his father, Eddard Stark, and defending northern sovereignty from southern treachery. However, cracks had begun to form in his alliances. His marriage to Talisa Maegir, in the books Jane Westerling, violated a marriage pact with House Frey, causing tension with the family that controlled the vital crossing at the Twins. Meanwhile, Robb's decision to execute Lord Rickard Karstark alienated one of his most powerful bannermen. All of this left him vulnerable. But imagine if Robb had managed to smooth things over with the Freys, perhaps by arranging a marriage between Edmure Tully and one of Walder Frey's daughters, as he ultimately did. If Walder Frey had accepted this olive branch and remained loyal, and if Rose Bolton had not turned cloak, then Robb Stark's army would have remained largely intact. The Red Wedding, after all, was a political ambush, not a defeat on the battlefield. Without that slaughter, Robb would still have thousands of loyal soldiers, strategic control of the Riverlands, and the backing of the North. This foundation would have allowed Robb to refocus his campaign on the Lannisters. With Casterly Rock exposed and Tywin Lannister deeply occupied in King's Landing, Robb might have turned his eyes westward. A march on the Westerlands could have been devastating to House Lannister. Without Tywin's manipulations and the betrayal by his allies, the North's military superiority could have delivered a crushing blow to the richest house in Westeros. Robb's war was never one of conquest. It was one of retribution and independence. But the optics of a northern king marching on Lannisport, laying siege to Casterly Rock, and defeating the Lannisters on their home soil would have sent a clear message. House Stark was no longer a regional power. It was a kingdom reborn. The Riverlands, as Robb's staging ground, would have flourished under Stark-Tully rule. Edmure Tully, despite his military blunders, would still be a useful vassal and symbolic leader of the region. Robb could have installed more loyal northern lords in key areas, perhaps giving Carhold to a lesser house loyal to the Starks after Karstark's betrayal. The Freys, having fulfilled their duty without treachery, would have likely been rewarded with trade routes and royal favor. Roose Bolton, never given the opportunity to betray his liege, might have been pushed to the sidelines politically, or even exposed as a disloyal conspirator by a wary Robb who began to see his ambition. With this solidified northern Riverland bloc, Robb could have issued terms to King's Landing. Tywin Lannister's alliance with the Tyrells, through the marriage of Joffrey and Margaery, would still hold, but it would face significant pressure. With Stannis defeated at Blackwater, but still alive, and Robb's armies undefeated in the field, the Lannisters would be forced to fight a war on multiple fronts. Cersei, always paranoid, would struggle to keep court politics stable, especially with the threat of Robb at her doorstep. Moreover, the Vale of Arryn could be tempted to join Robb's cause. Lysa Arryn was Catelyn's sister, and though erratic, her loyalty to family could be manipulated. If Robb had sent word to the Vale or even escorted Catelyn there to appeal in person, he may have gained access to thousands of Vale knights. With the Riverlands secure, the Vale involved, and northern loyalty high, Robb might have amassed a coalition powerful enough to march south and demand terms from the Iron Throne, or even seize it. One of the greatest wildcards in this scenario would be Jaime Lannister. At this time, he had been released by Catelyn Stark, with Brienne escorting him to King's Landing. If Robb's war continued, Jaime's return could complicate matters. Tywin would once again have his heir, but the damage may already be done. Jaime, disillusioned and grappling with honor and identity, might not return with the same ruthless loyalty. In fact, he might become sympathetic to Brienne's moral compass and begin questioning the legacy of his house. That inner turmoil could have significant consequences for the Lannisters' strategy. Meanwhile, the North itself, Winterfell, would be in a different position. With Robb alive, Bran and Rickon's fates might have come to light sooner. The Boltons never seize Winterfell, which means Theon's betrayal may have played out differently or even been prevented. Without the fall of Winterfell and the supposed death of the Stark boys, northern morale would be stronger than ever. The symbolic unity of House Stark, Robb as king, Catelyn as matriarch, and Bran, Rickon and Arya still alive, would give the people something to rally behind. The North remembers, and in this alternate timeline, it would have remembered victory rather than betrayal. Of course, not all consequences would be entirely positive. Robb's greatest weakness remained his inexperience in politics and his heart-driven decisions. His marriage to Talisa, though romantic, signaled a lack of understanding of political alliances. In a longer war, more of these decisions might have accumulated, yet without the Red Wedding, he would have had time to learn. Surrounded by advisors like Catelyn, the Blackfish, and perhaps even new allies like Stannis or the Arryns, Robb could have matured into a truly powerful ruler. The ripples of this alternate history would reach far beyond Westeros. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen's rise would still be unfolding, but the longer she delayed her invasion, the more entrenched a Stark-led North would become. Dany might arrive to find not a fractured realm, but a divided continent with a Stark kingdom in the north and a weakened Lannister dynasty in the south. The political calculus would change dramatically. Would Daenerys ally with Robb to take King's Landing, or would the two young monarchs clash, both believing themselves the rightful liberators? In the end, the survival of Robb Stark and the avoidance of the Red Wedding would not simply change who sat on which throne, it would alter the soul of the realm. The themes of vengeance, betrayal, and the futility of honor that defined Game of Thrones would take a different shape. Robb's campaign, once seen as a tragic tale of noble failure, could have become the stuff of legends, a northern king who rose against tyranny and reshaped Westeros. And as the snows fell and the true enemy beyond the wall stirred, a stronger, more united North under Robb Stark's leadership may have been the realm's best hope of survival. Had the Red Wedding never come to pass, Robb Stark's future, and indeed the fate of the entire realm, would have stood on the edge of a very different blade. Robb Stark, the young wolf, had already achieved a legendary status early in the War of the Five Kings. Victories at Whispering Wood, the capture of Jaime Lannister, and the rout at Oxcross earned him both fear and admiration. Yet Robb's youth and inexperience in courtly politics were his Achilles' heel. Without the shocking betrayal at the Twins, Robb's political and military story would have been allowed to unfold naturally. But where would that path have taken him? To understand what Robb's future might have looked like, we must examine three central possibilities. First, a sustained campaign for northern independence. Second, a broader ambition to take the Iron Throne itself. And third, the possibility of Robb Stark evolving into a new kind of Westerosi monarch, one who fundamentally reshaped the continent's balance of power. Let's begin with the most grounded and initially stated goal of Robb Stark, securing the North's independence. Robb never sought to conquer all of Westeros. His war began as retribution for Ned Stark's execution and a response to Lannister aggression in the Riverlands. His bannermen declared him king in the North, not because he desired a throne, but because they believed the South could no longer be trusted to rule over northern affairs. If the Red Wedding had not occurred, and the Freys and Boltons had remained loyal, Robb's army would have remained intact. In this scenario, Robb would likely have continued to press the Lannisters for formal recognition of northern independence. Such a goal would have required immense leverage, but Robb, controlling the Riverlands and potentially threatening Lannisport or Casterly Rock, might have eventually forced Tywin Lannister to the negotiating table. Especially as Tywin grew older and the war dragged on, the Lannisters may have chosen a pragmatic peace. Robb's continued victories, or even a war of attrition, could have tipped the scales in favor of a treaty that granted the North and Riverlands autonomy in exchange for peace. Such an outcome would have made Robb the first true king in the North, since Torrhen Stark bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror, re-establishing the ancient Northern Kingdom. However, that's not the only path Robb may have walked. As his power grew, and as the Lannisters became increasingly vulnerable, beset by threats from Stannis, internal strife and mounting debts, a new possibility could have emerged. Robb Stark as a contender for the Iron Throne itself. Though this was never Robb's stated goal, circumstances may have pushed him toward the center of power. With King's Landing destabilized, if the Tyrell alliance fractured, or if Stannis Baratheon fell, Robb may have found himself as the only remaining force capable of uniting Westeros. And unlike the other claimants, Robb possessed something rare, genuine love and loyalty from the people of the North and Riverlands. His cause was rooted in justice, not ambition. He was no usurper, no warmonger. If he had marched south with his bannermen and conquered King's Landing, or arrived as a stabilizing force after chaos consumed the capital, he may have been welcomed as a liberator. But the road to the Iron Throne would be fraught with contradictions. Robb had executed Rickard Karstark for betraying his principles. He had married for love, not strategy. His moral compass, while admirable, often clashed with the political pragmatism necessary to survive in Westeros. This raises the question, could Robb Stark have survived the Game of Thrones, even without the Red Wedding? Would he have learned to navigate its deadly complexities, or would he have suffered the same fate as his father, an honorable man undone by a dishonorable world? One could imagine a Robb who matures over time. If he had survived the war, secured peace, and established himself as king in the north, or even king of Westeros, he would have needed to learn the language of diplomacy. He might have leaned on Catelyn for her Tully-born knowledge of the south, or promoted advisors like the Blackfish, or even sought out new counselors from across the narrow sea or among the maesters. Robb would have had to evolve from a war commander into a statesman. Marriage, once a political liability, might have become a new avenue of diplomacy. Had Talisa survived and borne him children, Robb could have used marriage alliances to secure peace. Perhaps a future marriage pact between a Stark heir and a Tyrell or Martell might have cemented alliances that once eluded the north. Alternatively, if Talisa died in childbirth, a tragically common occurrence, Robb might have remarried for political advantage. In either case, the young wolf would become the cornerstone of a dynasty rather than the symbol of its ruin. Yet Robb's fate would not be decided solely by politics. A greater threat loomed beyond the wall. As the long night approached, the role of the North and its rulers became far more important than who sat on the Iron Throne. Would Robb Stark have recognized the threat in time? With Jon Snow rising in the Night's Watch, perhaps he would have had his half-brother's counsel. Jon's warnings, coupled with reports of White Walkers and wildlings moving south, could have led Robb to send forces to the Wall, or even ride north himself. This could have rewritten the final chapters of Westeros entirely. Rather than Daenerys and Jon leading the fight against the undead, it may have been Robb Stark commanding the armies of the living. His loyalty to the North, his military acumen, and his status as king would have positioned him as a natural leader in the face of apocalypse. With Stark banners flying beside Night's Watch, black and wildling furs, Westeros could have united under a northern king, not for conquest, but for survival. And what of Robb's legacy? Had he lived? Had he won? His reign might have marked a new era for Westeros. Whether ruling the North independently or sitting atop the Iron Throne, Robb's story would have symbolized a return to honor, a rejection of the cynical politics that had poisoned the realm. Instead of being remembered as a cautionary tale, a boy king who broke oaths and died at a wedding feast, he would be remembered as the man who restored balance. There are darker possibilities too. A victorious Robb might have struggled to maintain peace. Rival kingdoms might have refused to recognize his rule. His bannermen, once loyal in war, could turn fractious in peace. And if Daenerys Targaryen still landed with dragons, Robb would face a challenge unlike any before. Would he bend the knee to the mother of dragons? Would he fight her, risking all he had built? These questions remain tantalizing, but one thing is certain: Robb Stark's survival would have reshaped the entire history of Westeros. The North would remain strong, the Lannisters would be humbled, and the Game of Thrones might have turned toward unity rather than division. His fate, so tragically cut short in our timeline, might have become a shining chapter in Westeros's long and bloody story. The Red Wedding didn't just kill Robb Stark and Catelyn Tully. It fractured the very soul of the North. Without that treacherous massacre, the North would have remained not just militarily intact but spiritually unbroken. This section explores how the northern kingdoms might have stayed united under the banner of House Stark, and how this unity could have changed the political, cultural, and even military future of Westeros in ways no one in the south could have foreseen. Before the Red Wedding, the North was a bastion of loyalty. The Stark name commanded fierce devotion across the harsh, unforgiving regions of the North. From the towering keeps of House Umber to the icy fastness of House Karstark, the northern lords rallied behind Robb not because of greed or ambition, but out of love for the son of Ned Stark, a man they revered as the embodiment of honor. When Robb was declared king in the North, it wasn't merely a political move, it was a cultural resurgence. After centuries of southern rule, the Old Kingdom was rising again, draped in wolf banners and war cries. Had the Red Wedding not taken place, this momentum would have carried forward. Robb's hold over his bannermen would have strengthened with each campaign, each Lannister defeat, and each day the North stood firm. While cracks had begun to form, especially after Robb broke his marriage oath to the Freys and executed Lord Rickard Karstark, these were not irreparable. Political tensions in Westeros were constant, but in the North, feuds were historically tempered by ancient loyalty to Winterfell. Time, diplomacy, and victory would have healed these wounds. The Karstarks, though furious, might have been reconciled with titles or lands. The Freys, had they not resorted to betrayal, would have been honored with marriages and alliances. Roose Bolton, always a calculating man, might have seen more value in loyalty than treachery, had the war continued in Robb's favor. Importantly, Robb's continued reign would have prevented the rise of House Bolton. The Boltons, longtime rivals of the Starks, only gained prominence because of Roose Bolton's pivotal role in the Red Wedding. With Robb alive, Roose would never have been named Warden of the North. Ramsay Snow, the bastard of Bolton, would never have been legitimized. Winterfell would not have been burned, and the northern countryside would not have descended into terror and lawlessness. The reign of flayed men and sadistic hunts would have never arrived. Instead, the North would have remained Stark territory, harsh, honorable, and deeply rooted in tradition. The symbolic importance of a united North under Stark rule cannot be overstated. Winterfell wasn't just a castle, it was the beating heart of Northern identity. Its destruction at the hands of Theon Greyjoy and the subsequent takeover by the Boltons shattered that identity. But if Robb Stark had returned victorious, the castle could have been restored quickly. Bran and Rickon, still alive and hiding, might have been safely returned. Their survival under Robb's protection would have been a powerful narrative of resilience and hope. Arya's return, too, could have become a celebrated homecoming rather than the end of a blood-soaked journey. Culturally, a unified North would have reaffirmed its ancient values. Unlike the courtly intrigue of King's Landing or the wealth-driven politics of the Reach, Northern rule was rooted in simplicity and honor. Justice was delivered at the edge of a blade, not whispered in shadows. Under Robb, the Northern lords would have continued to emulate Eddard Stark's model of governance. Lords like Wyman Manderley, the Glovers, the Hornwoods, and the Reeds would have played key roles in rebuilding both infrastructure and morale. Trade routes to White Harbor could have been opened wider, bringing prosperity. The Night's Watch might have received better support, as Robb's respect for the Wall and its purpose would likely remain strong. Military unity would also be a significant factor. With the North at full strength and the Riverlands acting as a loyal southern frontier, the Starks would command a formidable force. Thousands of seasoned soldiers, hardened by battles in the Westerlands and Riverlands, could have defended the North from external threats or projected strength southward if needed. More importantly, they could have created a formidable wall against the real danger, the White Walkers. With no internal betrayal to weaken them, the Northern lords might have recognized the threat from beyond the Wall sooner, especially with Jon Snow sending word of what he'd seen. A Stark-led North could have mobilized armies not to fight for thrones, but to fight for survival. The religious aspect of unity must also be considered. The old gods were revered in the North with a depth and fervor unlike anything in the South. A strong and unshaken Northern realm would have fostered a revival of these traditions. The godswood of Winterfell, sacred and ancient, would have remained a site of reverence. With Bran still alive and growing in his connection to the Weirwoods and the Three-Eyed Raven, the spiritual strength of the North might have also found mystical significance. The union between pragmatic governance and ancient magic could have made the North not only a political force, but a spiritual center. This unity would have echoed across Westeros. Other regions would have taken notice. The Vale, bound by blood to House Stark through Catelyn, might have ended its isolationist policy and rejoined its northern allies. Dorne, perpetually resentful of the Iron Throne, might have found a kindred cause in the Starks' push for independence. Even the Iron Islands, though once a brutal enemy, might have sought terms after realizing the futility of raiding a strong and organized northern kingdom. With Robb alive and the northern lords united, there's even the possibility of institutional reform. The North could have served as an example of a different kind of kingdom, one ruled not by corruption or conquest, but by honor and stability. This might have inspired smallfolk revolts in the South, or emboldened discontented lords to push for change. A unified North could have become more than a kingdom. It could have become a symbol of resistance to Southern tyranny. The ripple effect would touch even personal relationships. Jon Snow's status as a bastard may have eventually been reconsidered by Robb. In the show, Robb writes a letter legitimizing Jon, an act that, if true in this timeline, could have reshaped Jon's destiny entirely. As a legitimate Stark, Jon might have taken a more active role in the politics of the North. The idea of Jon as Robb's heir or Warden of the North, in the event of Robb's death in battle, becomes far more plausible. Even the fate of Sansa would be radically altered. Without the fall of House Stark, she likely would have never ended up in King's Landing, never suffered at the hands of Joffrey or Ramsay. Instead, she could have married a northern lord, or even helped secure an alliance with a key southern house. Her trajectory, once marred by trauma, might have blossomed into one of diplomacy, strategy, and cultural leadership within the North. The psychological impact of a united North would also be profound. In the original timeline, Northern survivors like Arya, Sansa, and Jon are shaped by pain, betrayal, and disillusionment. But in this version of events, they grow under the banner of a family that endured. Their values, shaped not by revenge but by resilience, would forge a different type of leadership in the next generation. In conclusion, the survival of Robb Stark and the prevention of the Red Wedding wouldn't simply preserve the North, it would empower it. A united North would have had the strength to rebuild, to inspire, and to protect. It would have prevented the horrors of Bolton rule, preserved Stark leadership, and potentially turned the tide against both Lannister corruption and the White Walker apocalypse. The wolf banners would not have been torn down or stained with blood. They would have flown proudly from the wall to the neck and perhaps even beyond. The North remembers, and in this timeline, it remembers victory. The Red Wedding was made possible by two treacherous houses, House Frey and House Bolton, whose betrayals shattered the Northern cause and sent shockwaves throughout the Seven Kingdoms. But what if these betrayals never happened? What if Walder Frey and Roose Bolton had remained loyal to Robb Stark, or at the very least withheld their treason? This alternate path would have drastically altered their trajectories and the balance of power in Westeros. In this section, we explore the different fates of the Freys and Boltons in a world where the Red Wedding never occurred, and what roles they might have played in shaping a new political order. Let's begin with the Freys. House Frey of the twins was never a respected house. Despite its wealth and strategic location at the crossing of the Green Fork, the Freys were seen as up-jumped river lords, noble in name, but lacking in honor, prestige, and history. Their liege lords, House Tully, and most other great houses viewed them with disdain, and Walder Frey, aged and embittered, had long resented this. His decision to betray Robb Stark stemmed from a wounded ego after Robb broke the marriage pact by wedding Talisa Maegor. But if the Red Wedding never happened, perhaps because Edmure Tully's marriage to Rosalind Frey successfully smoothed things over, Walder would have kept his ambitions intact while staying loyal. In this alternate scenario, the Freys would have gained exactly what they always wanted: legitimacy and elevation. With Rosalind married to Edmure Tully, and Robb still relying on the twins for passage and logistics, Walder would have found himself positioned as a key power broker in the Riverlands. The Freys could have used their growing influence to press for more advantageous marriages, land grants, and trade routes. Their children and grandchildren might have married into more powerful houses, slowly lifting House Frey from mockery to genuine nobility. The perception of House Frey could have shifted from opportunists to loyal and valuable allies, much like how the Tyrells rose to prominence by aligning with power. Moreover, had the Freys remained loyal and played their cards wisely, they might have been granted official control over key river crossings and taxes on commerce. Robb, needing stability in the Riverlands, could have rewarded the Freys with additional titles or even named them hereditary lords paramount of the Trident if House Tully fell out of favor. With Edmure Tully still under pressure for his military blunders, such a reward could have appealed to Robb's desire to secure long-term loyalty and regional control. That said, Walder Frey's loyalty would always have been conditional. Known for his fickle nature and obsession with legacy, Frey might have looked for other ways to solidify his house's power. With the Red Wedding no longer an option, political scheming might have replaced outright murder. Perhaps the Freys would have sought to manipulate marriages or create disputes between other river lords to slowly extend their influence. But in a united Stark-led North and Riverlands, their room for such schemes would have been limited. Robb, Catelyn, and the Blackfish would likely have kept a close watch on the twins, ensuring the Freys were managed with caution. Now let's turn to House Bolton. The Boltons, unlike the Freys, had a far darker and more dangerous history. Longtime rivals of House Stark, the Boltons were infamous for their brutal traditions, including flaying enemies alive, and were only integrated into the Stark fold through centuries of suppression. Roose Bolton's betrayal was not just political opportunism, it was a return to ambition rooted in centuries-old resentment. By aligning with Tywin Lannister and orchestrating the Red Wedding, Roose achieved his long-desired goal of becoming Warden of the North. But in a timeline where the Red Wedding never happens, Roose's path to power is blocked. In this alternate reality, Roose Bolton must remain outwardly loyal to Robb Stark, or risk being branded a traitor. Without Tywin's promise of titles and rewards, Roose's betrayal carries no guarantee of success. If he turns cloak and fails, he loses everything. Roose does nothing if not pragmatic. In a scenario where the Starks are strong and gaining ground in the war, he may deem treachery too risky. Instead, Roose might bide his time, waiting for signs of weakness or opportunities to undermine Robb politically rather than militarily. Still, Robb was not blind to Rose's calculating nature. The execution of Rickard Karstark left a void in Robb's army leadership, and Rose's was given command of the rearguard. But had the war continued without the Red Wedding, Robb might have reconsidered Rose's place in the War Council. He could have shifted military responsibilities to more trusted lords like the Mormonts or Umbers, and gradually pushed Rose's to the periphery. In fact, Catelyn Stark, known for her political instincts, might have sensed the danger Rose's posed and counseled Robb to take preventive action, possibly stripping Rose's of key command posts or keeping him under watch. The bastard of Bolton, Ramsay Snow, would also face a drastically different fate. In the original timeline, Rose's legitimizes Ramsay and makes him heir to the Dreadfort, elevating him from a sadistic side character to one of the most feared men in Westeros. But without Rose's rise to Warden of the North, Ramsay remains a bastard with no legitimacy, no army, and no castle. His cruel antics may continue in the background, but without the resources of House Bolton or the chaos following the Red Wedding, Ramsay's horrors remain contained. The invasion of Winterfell by Ramsay would never occur. Sansa would never be wed to him. The atrocities committed during his brief reign over the North would be erased from the timeline. With both House Frey and House Bolton aligned, however reluctantly, with the Starks, the political map of the North and Riverlands would stabilize. The Starks, Tullys, Freys, and even the Boltons could form a delicate but functional coalition. The Freys would provide logistical support and river access. The Boltons would contribute military might, albeit with watchful oversight, and the Starks would command through legitimacy and love. This alliance would also have ripple effects in the south. Tywin Lannister's strategy of breaking northern power through betrayal would have failed. With neither the Freys nor Boltons defecting, the Lannisters would be forced into a prolonged conflict they were ill prepared for. Their enemies would be numerous: Stannis Baratheon in the east, the Tyrells watching carefully in the south, and the Starks pressing from the north. Tywin's genius relied on controlling key chess pieces, and without the Red Wedding, two of his most crucial pawns remain loyal to his enemies. In the long term, the Freys and Boltons may have attempted to grow their power through subtler means. The Freys would likely try to marry their way into every powerful family they could. Walder Frey had over 100 descendants, an army of potential political tools. If even a few of them married into houses like Bracken, Blackwood, or even the Vale, the Freys could entrench themselves into Westeros's noble fabric, no longer derided as the late Lord's brood. The Boltons, however, would always remain more dangerous. Roose may have taken a quieter approach, slowly building loyalty among minor houses, nurturing spies, and waiting for the moment when he could strike without risking complete annihilation. Alternatively, if Robb's reign was long and prosperous, Roose may have faded into obscurity, a dangerous man without opportunity. But perhaps the most poetic consequence is that both the Freys and Boltons would remain footnotes rather than major players. No infamous betrayal, no cruel reign, no flayed banners flying over Winterfell. Their legacies would be ones of cautious loyalty rather than infamy, small men with big ambitions, forever overshadowed by the greatness of House Stark. In a Westeros without the Red Wedding, the Freys and Boltons take a different path. Not one of blood and betrayal, but one of patience, diplomacy, and ultimately, missed opportunity. And while that world might lack the shocking twist that stunned millions, it gained something far more rare in Westeros: stability. In the blood-soaked world of Westeros, Catelyn Stark stood as one of the few characters whose strength stemmed not from a sword, but from political insight, maternal devotion, and personal resilience. Her death at the Red Wedding was not only a loss for House Stark, but for Robb's entire war effort. She was his most experienced advisor, a seasoned noblewoman who had navigated the treacherous currents of southern politics, witnessed the fall of her husband, and understood the cost of war better than her son ever could. If the Red Wedding never occurred, and Catelyn Stark survived, her continued presence would have had a profound effect on the direction, duration, and possible outcome of the War of the Five Kings. To appreciate the depth of Catelyn's potential influence, we need to recognize that she was more than just Robb's mother. She was a Tully by birth, with deep connections in the Riverlands, and one of the few individuals who had the foresight to see the dangers ahead, not only in terms of military threats, but in political fallout and broken alliances. Her instincts were shaped by a lifetime of courtly etiquette and noble politics. In many ways, she was the counterpart to Ned Stark, where Ned valued honor above all. Catelyn understood the necessity of strategy and compromise. At the time of her death, Catelyn had already made several pivotal moves. She had freed Jaime Lannister in a controversial attempt to trade him for her daughters, an act that fractured Robb's trust in her and angered his bannermen. But even that seemingly reckless move was driven by maternal instinct and political calculation. She knew that the war could not be sustained forever, and that peace, or at least a settlement, would require hostages and leverage. With her survival, and the war continuing without the trauma of the Red Wedding, Catelyn would have had the opportunity to rebuild her reputation within Robb's inner circle and reassert her value as a political advisor. One of the clearest roles Catelyn would have played is as a diplomat and negotiator. Her unique position as a Tully and a Stark made her a bridge between the Riverlands and the North. She understood the delicate nature of Robb's multi-regional alliance, and her tact could have soothed wounded pride among key houses, particularly the Freys and Karstarks. She might have been the one to broker a better deal with Walder Frey after Robb's marriage to Talisa. Perhaps she could have ensured Edmure's marriage was not just a political arrangement, but a true union that elevated House Frey's standing without feeding Walder's thirst for vengeance. Moreover, her Tully heritage would have helped maintain cohesion in the Riverlands. With Edmure Tully often portrayed as ineffectual, Catelyn could have stepped into the power vacuum to help govern Riverrun while Robb focused on his military campaign. She knew the local lords, the feuds between families like the Brackens and Blackwoods, and the terrain of her homeland. With her experience and presence, the Riverlands may have remained more stable and productive under Stark-Tully rule, allowing Robb to supply his army more effectively and focus on larger strategic objectives. Another area where Catelyn's influence would have been invaluable is in managing Robb's council. As the war progressed, Robb grew increasingly isolated from his bannermen. The execution of Rickard Karstark was a divisive moment, one that led to the loss of thousands of troops and shook the unity of his war effort. Catelyn, had she been more integrated into these decisions, may have counseled a less severe course of action, perhaps imprisonment or a delayed execution, to avoid alienating key allies. Even if she had agreed with the sentence, her involvement in the process could have softened its political consequences. Her ability to read people and anticipate reactions made her one of the few who might have kept Robb's ego and honor in check when necessary. Then there's the matter of Robb's marriage. Catelyn deeply disapproved of his union with Talisa, knowing full well the political catastrophe it could bring. But even after the fact, she may have found ways to salvage alliances. Rather than letting the marriage be a rupture in their strategy, Catelyn could have worked behind the scenes to repair relations with offended parties, particularly the Freys. She may have negotiated additional lands or titles for Walder Frey's sons, or suggested alternative marriage alliances for other Stark bannermen. Her pragmatic mind would not have dwelled on what could not be undone, but would have sought new paths forward. Beyond the battlefield and council chamber, Catelyn's survival would have had profound emotional and psychological effects on Robb himself. As young as he was, Robb bore the burden of kingship with immense weight. Catelyn was the one person who could speak to him not as a subject but as a mother, reminding him of the values of House Stark while tempering the arrogance that came with battlefield success. Her presence could have anchored Robb during critical moments of doubt, frustration, or temptation. She may have been the calming voice that turned his fury into wisdom, his pride into patience. Her continued presence also offers a powerful what-if regarding other alliances, especially with the Vale and the Baratheons. Catelyn's sister, Lysa Arryn, ruled the Vale. Though emotionally unstable and paranoid, Lysa still held the Vale's powerful armies behind the Aerys' impregnable walls. Catelyn, as her sister, may have been able to coax Lysa into action, or at least secure the neutrality of the Vale, while allowing northern forces safe passage. This alone could have changed the outcome of the war. Imagine Stark forces bolstered by the elite knights of the Vale, pressuring Lannister supply lines and threatening King's Landing from the east. As for Stannis Baratheon, Catelyn respected his claim to the throne, perhaps more than any other contender. Had she lived to see Stannis's efforts post-Blackwater and his mission to the Wall, she may have urged Robb to consider a northern alliance with him. While Robb was declared king in the north, a pragmatic alliance with Stannis, perhaps based on mutual respect for law, justice, and shared enemies, could have been achievable. Catelyn's diplomacy and her personal experiences at King's Landing would have made her a valuable intermediary in these high-level negotiations. Another intriguing consequence of Catelyn's survival lies in her connection to the spiritual realm. In the main timeline, Catelyn is resurrected by Beric Dondarrion and becomes Lady Stoneheart, a vengeful specter dedicated to punishing Lannister and Frey loyalists. In this alternate scenario, that path is erased, but her spiritual presence remains powerful. A living Catelyn may have eventually encountered the Brotherhood without banners, gaining first-hand knowledge of the magic and mystery growing in the Riverlands. Her involvement in such circles could have added an entirely new dimension to her influence, perhaps even connecting her with Melisandre or Thoros of Myr, and shaping her understanding of the larger threats rising in the world. Most importantly, Catelyn's survival would have meant the preservation of maternal leadership in the Stark family. With Ned gone, her presence helped maintain not just Robb's stability, but the family's legacy. She may have reunited with Arya had the war gone in the Starks' favor. She could have helped retrieve Bran and Rickon from the shadows of anonymity, and she certainly would have played a key role in preparing Jon Snow's re-entry into northern politics, whether as Robb's successor or as a vital guardian at the Wall. Had Robb died in battle, years later, under nobler conditions, Catelyn could have served as Queen Mother or Regent of the North. With her surviving children returned, she would have ensured a smooth transition of power, whether to Sansa, Arya, or a legitimized Jon. Her wisdom would have guided Winterfell through the aftermath of war and into peace, strengthening northern autonomy and preserving the values of House Stark. In sum, Catelyn Stark's influence in a post-Red Wedding timeline cannot be overstated. She was a unifier, a strategist, a mother, and a diplomat. Her voice, cut short in one of the series' most shocking betrayals, could have become one of the most important guiding forces of the war and its aftermath. With her alive, the Starks would not only have stood taller, they might have prevailed entirely. In the original timeline of Game of Thrones, Arya Stark's arc is forged in the fires of tragedy, vengeance, and anonymity. Her transformation from a playful, rebellious girl into a faceless assassin is among the most radical character evolutions in the entire series. But this metamorphosis was catalyzed irreversibly by the Red Wedding. The moment she arrived at the Twins, only to witness the brutal slaughter of her mother and brother, Arya Stark died in spirit. What emerged from that trauma was a ghost cloaked in vengeance. But if the Red Wedding had never happened, if Arya had been reunited with her family instead of standing helplessly outside its destruction, her entire journey would have taken a drastically different path. Her destiny, her morality, and even her place in Westeros's future would have been rewritten. To understand how different her story might have been, we must first remember Arya's state leading up to the Red Wedding. Having escaped King's Landing after Ned's execution, she had survived on sheer grit. She passed as a boy, served Tywin Lannister as a cupbearer, and endured the chaos of the Riverlands alongside Gendry and Hot Pie. By the time she was captured by the Brotherhood without banners and later taken by Sandor Clegane, the Hound, Arya was hardened, quick-witted, and deeply distrustful. But she was still Arya, a girl with a family she believed she could return to. In the canon timeline, her hope of reunion is crushed in a single moment outside the Twins. She watches as Stark men are slaughtered, as Grey Wind's head is sewn onto Robb's body, and as the Northern cause is annihilated. This trauma extinguishes her hope, erodes her innocence, and sets her on the path toward the House of Black and White in Braavos. But in a timeline where the Red Wedding never occurs, Arya reaches the Twins in time to reunite with her family. The difference this makes to her story cannot be overstated. Imagine it. Arya, cloaked in dirt and trauma, arrives at the Twins. Instead of carnage, she sees Stark banners flying, hears laughter and music, and is embraced by her mother and brother. The grief that had calcified inside her cracks. Reuniting with Catelyn and Robb would have been a moment of healing, not just for Arya, but for the audience. She would have found safety for the first time since leaving King's Landing, and perhaps more importantly, she would have found purpose in life beyond survival and vengeance. Catelyn would undoubtedly recognize that Arya had changed. The fierce girl who once chased cats and sword-fought with sticks was now a survivor with blood on her hands. But Catelyn, ever the nurturing mother, would have guided her daughter back toward herself. Robb, too, would have been awestruck by the resilience of his little sister. With family restored, Arya could have begun healing rather than descending deeper into darkness. It's possible, even likely, that Arya would have resumed some form of martial training. Her time with Syrio Forel, her experiences on the road, and her bond with the Sword Needle gave her a taste for combat that wouldn't vanish with safety. But in this alternate future, she wouldn't need to abandon her name, her face, or her humanity to become powerful. Instead of the House of Black and White, perhaps Arya would have trained under her own family's watch. The North has no shortage of warriors. Sir Roderick Castle may have fallen, but figures like Maegay Mormont, the Blackfish, and even Jon Snow could have nurtured her skills in a setting of loyalty, not cruelty. Arya's growing skill set might have been redirected toward espionage, scouting, or serving as a diplomat, roles fitting her talents and courage. With her small size, quick thinking, and instincts honed by survival, Arya could have been a critical asset to Robb's campaign. Perhaps she would have infiltrated Lannister-held territory, spied on enemy movements, or served as a messenger between Robb's forces and potential allies. She was always brave enough to walk into danger. Now she would have had purpose and support behind her. There's also the possibility that Arya might have joined her brother Jon at the Wall. In the original timeline, Arya and Jon's reunion is one of the most emotional in the final season. But in this alternate path, Arya could have made the journey north much earlier, perhaps after Robb secured a peace treaty with the Lannisters or King's Landing. Her bond with Jon was one of the deepest in the Stark family, and if Jon warned them of the White Walkers, Arya might have chosen to fight alongside him. Imagine Arya at the Battle of Castle Black, fighting alongside the Night's Watch, not as a faceless assassin, but as a Stark of Winterfell. Without the House of Black and White, Arya's relationship with death would also shift dramatically. In the canon timeline, Arya becomes obsessed with death, reciting her kill list, worshipping the many-faced god, and losing her identity. Her training requires her to abandon Arya Stark altogether, but without the Red Wedding, she never becomes no one. She remains Arya of House Stark, a girl of noble birth and northern pride. Her relationship with death becomes one of warrior defiance, not mystical submission. She kills not as a servant of death, but as a protector of life. And that list, the infamous kill list, might never come into existence. Or if it did, it would be shorter, less obsessive, more practical than ritualistic. Without the trauma of the Red Wedding, Arya's heart wouldn't need to burn so cold. Maybe she would still want justice for those who wronged her father, but she wouldn't be defined by revenge. Instead of fixating on names like Cersei, Eileen Payne, and Melisandre, she might have chosen a different form of justice, bringing them to court, or executing them under Stark law if needed. Perhaps the most significant change would be Arya's place in the Stark family's future. In the show, Arya becomes a wanderer, setting sail for lands unknown after the war ends. Her story concludes not with the rebuilding of House Stark, but with escape. But in a world where the Red Wedding never happened, and the family remained intact, Arya might have had a different ending. She could have taken a place at Winterfell as its protector, or perhaps she would have served as an emissary between houses, or as a commander of a new Stark scouting corps, trained to handle threats both human and supernatural. In fact, Arya's personality, bold, independent, and non-traditional, might have allowed her to forge a new role for women in the North. Inspired by her, other noble girls might have pursued martial training. The old roles would have bent to Arya's presence, not the other way around. She may have inspired reform within northern society, much like Daenerys did in Essos, though on a smaller and more localized scale. And what of romance? Arya's canon timeline allows for little in the way of love, save for a brief connection with Gendry near the end. In this version, with more stability and emotional growth, perhaps she and Gendry build a relationship earlier, reunited under better circumstances, and with Arya still connected to her family. The idea of Arya marrying and even leading alongside Gendry, Lord of Storm's End, becomes plausible. A union between House Stark and Baratheon could have mended old political rifts and forged a powerful Northern Stormlands alliance. Finally, there's the question of legacy. Arya, as she existed in the canon, leaves behind little legacy. No titles, no family, no descendants, only a legend whispered across the sea. But in this alternate world, Arya's legacy would be far more tangible. Whether through teaching, defending her home, or helping shape a new political order, Arya Stark would become more than an assassin in the shadows. She would become a founding figure in the restoration of the North, remembered not only for her skills, but for her heart, her family loyalty, and her return to the light. In the end, Arya's journey without the Red Wedding would still be one of growth and strength, but not of solitude and vengeance. Her blade would still be sharp, her heart still brave, but her soul would be whole. The girl who once danced in Winterfell's halls and whispered secrets with Jon in the snow would grow into a leader shaped not by loss, but by love. Sansa Stark's journey in Game of Thrones is one of captivity, manipulation, and eventual empowerment. From the moment her father is executed in King's Landing, Sansa becomes a political pawn, passed from one tormentor to another. In the canon timeline, the Red Wedding seals her isolation and destroys any hope she had of being rescued by her family. Her brother and mother are dead. Her northern home is in ashes. Her name, once noble, is now a liability. But in a timeline where the Red Wedding never happens and Robb Stark survives, Sansa's trajectory, and the very future of the Stark legacy would be rewritten. Instead of enduring trauma in the shadows of the Lannisters and Boltons, Sansa could emerge as a central figure in the Northern resurgence, playing a critical role in the restoration and leadership of House Stark. At the time of the Red Wedding, Sansa is still in King's Landing, betrothed to Tyrion Lannister against her will. Joffrey's cruelty has left her traumatized, her father's death has destroyed her innocence, and her every move is monitored by Cersei and Littlefinger. Yet even in this cage, Sansa learns. She absorbs the language of politics, the rules of power, and the subtle art of manipulation. These lessons, in a future without the Red Wedding, would become tools, not for survival, but for leadership. Had Robb and Catelyn survived the Frey crossing, and the Northern cause remained strong, the political tides in King's Landing would begin to shift. The Lannisters' main advantage, the destruction of their enemies, would vanish. With Robb's army intact, and the Riverlands loyal, the pressure on the Iron Throne would increase dramatically. Tywin Lannister's strategy relied heavily on removing Robb from the board. In this alternate timeline, Sansa's position as both a Stark and a hostage becomes far more precarious and more valuable. With Robb still alive, Sansa remains the key to uniting the North with another powerful house through marriage. In the show, this idea is exploited by the Boltons when they wed her to Ramsay to claim the North through legitimacy. But in a world where House Stark remains unbroken, Sansa's hand in marriage becomes a tool of diplomacy, not domination. She could be used to forge an alliance with the Vale, the Reach, or even Dorne, regions wary of Lannister dominance and open to partnerships with the increasingly formidable North. One likely outcome is that Robb would seek Sansa's release through diplomatic channels or covert efforts. Knowing she was being held as a political prisoner, he may have used Jaime Lannister's return as leverage, resuming the trade first initiated by Catelyn. Alternatively, the pressure of Northern military power pressing on the Riverlands and the Westerlands might have forced Tywin's hand. Sansa could be returned as part of a peace negotiation or, if necessary, rescued through an operation orchestrated by Northern agents or even Littlefinger himself, who may still attempt to leverage her for his own gain. Regardless of how she leaves King's Landing, Sansa's return to her family would be a moment of immense transformation. No longer the naive girl who dreamed of songs and silken gowns, she would return to Winterfell armed with knowledge few in the North possessed. She would understand the politics of the court, the ambitions of southern houses, and the cold reality of power. Robb, wise enough to recognize the value of counsel, might entrust her with diplomatic responsibilities, negotiating with potential allies, managing letters and missives, or advising on southern etiquette. She would be, in essence, the North's ambassador to a world that once imprisoned her. Sansa's return would also mark a healing point for House Stark. Her presence alongside Robb, Arya, and their younger brothers would symbolize the resilience of their bloodline. With the family reunited, their rule would gain a powerful sense of legitimacy, not just through military victories, but through unity and survival. The people of the North, who had suffered so much, would find hope in seeing the daughters of Winterfell restored to their ancestral home. In time, Sansa's role might evolve from diplomatic envoy to ruler. Should Robb fall in battle or die without an heir, Sansa could rise as Lady of Winterfell or even Queen in the North, depending on the political structure that emerged post-war. Her education in King's Landing, combined with her Stark blood and hard-earned wisdom, would make her uniquely suited for leadership. She could command loyalty from noble houses, while understanding the Game of Thrones better than most players born to it. Additionally, her relationship with Littlefinger might have played out differently. In the canon timeline, he rescues her from King's Landing and whisks her into his own schemes, ultimately leading to her marriage to Ramsay Bolton. But in this alternate reality, Littlefinger's hold on Sansa would be far weaker. With Robb alive and the Stark power base intact, Sansa would have less need for his protection and more leverage to resist his manipulation. She might still accept his aid, but on her own terms. Perhaps she even exposes his role in the betrayal of Ned Stark and sows discord between him and the Lannisters, or the Vale. There's also the potential that Sansa's influence would reach beyond the North. She could be instrumental in forging alliances with other regions that mistrust the Lannisters. A match between her and a nobleman from the Vale or the Stormlands could strengthen ties between formerly divided houses. Alternatively, if Daenerys Targaryen eventually lands in Westeros, Sansa might serve as a key negotiator between the Targaryen queen and the northern forces. Her diplomatic skills, honed in the capital, would allow her to bridge gaps that swords could not. Importantly, Sansa's development would retain its themes of survival and transformation, but with less emphasis on trauma and more on agency. She would no longer be shaped solely by cruelty and fear, but by resilience, experience, and a growing understanding of how to wield power responsibly. Her personal growth would be steeped in strategy and family legacy, rather than pain and revenge. Without Ramsay, her body and mind would remain unbroken. Without being passed between abusers, her self-worth would be intact. This would have massive implications for how she ruled, how she related to others, and how she raised future generations. The strength she gained from enduring torment in the original timeline would still be present, but in this version, it would be tempered by stability and family support, not forged by isolation. Even romantically, Sansa's future becomes brighter. Free from the Lannisters' control, she might be allowed to choose her own path, perhaps rekindling a connection with Gendry, Sir Loras Tyrell, if still alive, or another eligible nobleman. Or perhaps she chooses not to marry at all, and instead becomes a northern queen in her own right, wise, commanding, and unshackled from the chains of forced union. Her voice would echo in northern politics, shaping reforms and policies. Perhaps she would help improve the rights of noblewomen, inspired by her own struggles. Perhaps she would introduce a more formal court structure to Winterfell, blending northern traditions with her southern experience. Through her, the old ways and the new might find harmony. In short, the survival of Robb Stark and the absence of the Red Wedding gives Sansa a future shaped by purpose rather than pain. Instead of a pawn, she becomes a player. Instead of a victim, she becomes a visionary. Her role in the restoration of House Stark is not passive, it is foundational. She helps rebuild the Stark name not just with banners and steel, but with diplomacy, patience, and quiet strength. In a Westeros without the Red Wedding, Sansa Stark's song is not one of silence or suffering. It is a melody of power, perseverance, and the future of the North. In the brutal and complex chessboard of Westeros, few rivalries held as much tension, promise, and narrative weight as that of Robb Stark and Jaime Lannister. In the canon timeline, their enmity was cut short. Robb outmaneuvered Jaime at the Battle of the Whispering Wood, capturing the Kingslayer and securing one of the war's most valuable hostages. But the two never met again. Jaime was released by Catelyn in a desperate attempt to barter for her daughter's freedom. And Robb's campaign ended in betrayal before the two could cross swords a second time. But what if the Red Wedding never happened? What if Robb had lived? Jaime had returned to the field, and the two most charismatic young war leaders in Westeros had the chance to clash again on the battlefield, in the War Council, or even in philosophy. In this alternate timeline, Jaime Lannister returns to King's Landing in relative disgrace. Freed by Lady Stark and escorted by Brienne of Tarth, he walks into a court simmering with political tension. His father, Tywin, is furious, not just at Jaime's absence, but at the cost of losing such a critical bargaining chip. However, Tywin is pragmatic. He needs Jaime. With the war against Robb Stark still raging, and the Riverlands slipping from Lannister control, Jaime is not simply a son, he is a weapon. Though he has lost a hand in the show timeline, if you prefer a book-based approach where this timeline splits off earlier, Jaime may return still whole. Regardless of his physical state, his presence as a commander is crucial. Tywin, recognizing Jaime's battlefield prowess and the need to counter Robb's unrelenting campaign, sends him west to bolster Lannister forces in the Riverlands and the Westerlands. Here lies the possibility of a second confrontation, 1 year in the making. Robb Stark, no longer the boy who won by ambush, but a seasoned general who has held together alliances, put down dissent, and outlasted the most cunning forces of the South. Jaime, returning from captivity humbled, more introspective, but still prideful and driven. Their clash would be more than just a physical battle, it would be a war of ideology, experience, and reputation. Robb's early victories over Jaime made him a legend. Songs were sung of the young wolf, the boy king who captured the Kingslayer, but legends come with expectations, and expectations can weigh heavily. Robb now faces a more cautious and possibly bitter Jaime, backed by Tywin's relentless strategy. If Jaime commands Lannister forces in the field again, it would likely be under stricter guidance, with Tywin watching every maneuver. Jaime's goal: reclaim the Riverlands, restore Lannister honor, and if possible, destroy Robb Stark. But Robb has changed too. With the Freys and Boltons still loyal, his army remains intact. With Catelyn alive, and Arya and Sansa potentially recovered, or on their way to safety, he may fight not just for vengeance, but for a future. A rematch with Jaime wouldn't be about proving himself anymore, it would be about ending the war. Robb may not need to kill Jaime, he may seek to capture him again to force better terms. But would Jaime allow that? Would he risk another capture, another embarrassment, or would he fight to the death to reclaim his family's honor? Their reunion could happen in various ways, One possibility is on the battlefield, perhaps near River Run or the Golden Tooth. A Lannister army, led by Jaime, clashes with the Northern Riverland forces under Robb. The tension of that meeting would be palpable. Both men would be aware of the stakes, not just for their houses, but for their legacies. The fight could go either way. Jaime, though older and more experienced, is now dealing with the fallout of his capture, and the lingering question of whether he is still the best swordsman in Westeros. Robb, meanwhile, has been undefeated in open battle. The world watches to see who blinks first. Alternatively, the rematch could come not through steel, but through words. Imagine a parley, a diplomatic meeting arranged to negotiate terms. Robb and Jaime, flanked by bannermen and bodyguards, face off across a table. The atmosphere is heavy with years of war, bloodshed, and personal loss. Jaime, who has undergone a degree of soul-searching after his captivity and growing bond with Brienne, might approach Robb with a new perspective. He may question the value of endless war. He might even confess his motivations in killing the Mad King, offering insight into his choices. Robb, in turn, might see in Jaime a man haunted by his past, but still dangerous. This dialogue could become one of the most compelling in Westerosi history. Cambay, the disgraced knight seeking some redemption. Robb, the boy king who bore the mantle of vengeance and victory with growing weariness. The two might not come to blows, but they would test each other with every word. Robb might see a shadow of Ned Stark's warnings in Jariah's pride. Jariah might glimpse the cost of Tywin's war, reflected in Robb's hardened eyes. A rematch of ideologies, not just arms. But what if the rematch comes under darker circumstances? Suppose Robb dies later in the war, not at the Twins, but in battle. Sansa or Arya becomes the new head of House Stark. Jaime, by this point, has turned against Cersei and Tywin, and is seeking to make amends. His path leads him to the north, hoping to broker peace or even fight alongside them against a common enemy. Perhaps Daenerys, perhaps the White Walkers. Would the North ever accept him? Would Arya or Sansa forgive the man who helped destroy their family? Would Jon Snow, if legitimized, show mercy? In this timeline, Jaime might spend his final years trying to undo the legacy he helped build. Perhaps he sacrifices himself in battle, not for glory, but for redemption. His rematch with Robb, even if never fought with swords, becomes one of legacy and morality. Jaime's story was always one of contradiction, a man who performed monstrous acts in the name of love or duty. Robb's survival forces Jaime to confront those contradictions fully, perhaps becoming a changed man, not because of captivity or Brienne, but because of the mirror Robb Stark holds up to him. Of course, it's also possible that the rematch ends in tragedy. Jaime, pressed by Lannister expectations and his father's wrath, may choose duty over growth. If he rides to battle against Robb and kills him, fairly or not, he would be remembered forever as the man who slew the young wolf. The North would never forgive him. He would never forgive himself. The war might end, but Jaime's soul would remain scarred beyond repair. His honor would once again be compromised, not by wildfire, but by wolf's blood. Alternatively, Robb kills Jaime in the field. The Kingslayer dies, not on his knees, but in the mud and blood of war, finally beaten by the young king he once underestimated. The death of Jaime would send shockwaves through the realm. Tywin would be enraged, Cersei would be devastated. The Lannister cause might collapse entirely, or double down in fury. Either way, Robb's legend would grow even larger. But would the man grow colder, more isolated, as he bears the weight of killing a man he once held captive and treated honorably? In the end, the rematch between Jaime Lannister and Robb Stark is not simply about vengeance or victory. It's about what each man represents. Robb is the symbol of rising honor, youthful justice, and the dream of northern independence. Jaime is the fated golden lion, clawing for relevance and redemption in a world that no longer trusts him. Their clash, whether in battle, in words, or in destiny, would redefine the war for the Seven Kingdoms. Had the Red Wedding never occurred, their rivalry might have grown into one of the defining stories of the realm. Two men, shaped by war, bound by family, haunted by legacy, standing on opposite sides of history, each wondering if they could have been something more. Tywin Lannister was many things: ruthless, calculating, and brilliantly cold-blooded. He was the architect of Lannister dominance, the man who held his house together through sheer force of will, and the tactical mastermind who preserved the Iron Throne for his grandson amid rebellion and chaos. But of all his victories, none was more decisive or more treacherous than the Red Wedding. It was his masterpiece of backroom diplomacy and brutal pragmatism. destroying Robb Stark's army not through open war, but through betrayal. The moment Roose Bolton drove a dagger into Robb's heart, Tywin secured what he could never win through force, peace with the North. But in a world where the Red Wedding never happens, Tywin's war strategy begins to crumble, and the long golden shadow of House Lannister starts to fade. Let's begin by looking at Tywin's grand design. The war between the Lannisters and the Starks had entered a protracted phase. Though Robb Stark had bested Jaime in the Riverlands and held the North in a firm grip, the Lannisters were far from defeated. Tywin relied on several pillars to prop up his war strategy: controlling King's Landing, manipulating southern alliances, namely the Tyrells, using the Freys and Boltons as traitorous knives in the back, and consolidating royal legitimacy through the Iron Throne and its marriages. The Red Wedding, in canon, allowed Tywin to shortcut years of bloodshed, but without that massacre, he is forced to fight a war of attrition he cannot afford. First, there is the matter of military strength. Tywin's forces had already been stretched thin by the time of Robb's campaign. With Jaime captured, he was forced to fight on multiple fronts against Stannis in the east, Robb in the Riverlands and the west, and politically in King's Landing. His decision to retreat from the Riverlands and allow Gregor Clegane to terrorize the countryside was a stopgap, not a strategy. Robb Stark's army, by contrast, remained undefeated. If the Red Wedding never occurred, Robb would continue his campaign, possibly pushing deeper into the Westerlands or solidifying his grip on the Riverlands. Either path would place immense pressure on Tywin's forces. Every passing day that Robb remained alive was a threat to Tywin's legacy. Tywin understood the symbolism of kingship. If Robb, declared king in the north, was allowed to rule unchallenged, other kingdoms might follow his example. Dorne had no love for the Iron Throne. The Vale was independent and tightly controlled by Lysa Arryn. The Riverlands were already fracturing. The idea that the North could simply secede from the Seven Kingdoms and face no consequences was an existential threat to the very notion of centralized power, and therefore to the Lannisters' legitimacy. Complicating matters further was the alliance with House Tyrell. Tywin's marriage pact between Margaery Tyrell and Joffrey Baratheon was intended to secure the Reach's military and economic support, and more importantly, give the Lannisters the food supplies they desperately needed. But the Tyrells were not fools. They aligned with the Lannisters because they saw a future of shared power. But if the Lannisters began to falter, if Robb's victories mounted, and the North pushed further into the Westerlands, House Tyrell might reconsider. They could stall their military support, back a rival king, or even make overtures to Robb Stark himself. Tywin would be aware of this potential shift. In a world without the Red Wedding, every Lannister defeat is a nail in the coffin of their alliance with the Tyrells. Mace Tyrell wanted glory for his house. Olenna Tyrell wanted security and legacy. Neither of those goals aligned with a prolonged, bloody war that the Lannisters were losing. If Tywin began to look like a liability, the Tyrells might abandon the marriage pact and pursue one with another royal house. Imagine if Margaery were betrothed to Robb Stark or another claimant. The entire balance of power would flip overnight. Another critical problem for Tywin would be public perception. The Lannisters were already unpopular, especially in the Riverlands where their armies committed repeated atrocities. The longer the war dragged on, the more Robb Stark appeared as a righteous rebel rather than a usurper. Songs and stories would romanticize him as the young wolf, the noble king standing against tyranny. The Lannisters, meanwhile, would be viewed as oppressive and corrupt. Tywin may not have cared about songs, but public perception affects loyalty. Every small folk uprising, every defection, every house that chose neutrality over allegiance weakened Tywin's grip on the realm. And then there's the financial strain. Tywin was well aware that the wealth of House Lannister, though immense, was not limitless. In fact, the Lannisters were heavily indebted to the Iron Bank of Braavos. War is expensive, and without the swift end provided by the Red Wedding, Tywin would be forced to continue pouring gold into campaigns, supplies, and bribes. As the debts piled up, the Lannisters' reputation as the realm's wealthiest house would begin to crack, and the Iron Bank, known for its patience but not its forgiveness, might turn to another claimant, say, Stannis Baratheon, who could promise to pay his debts with victory. The political situation in King's Landing would also grow more fragile. With Joffrey still on the throne, Tywin had to deal with a volatile, sadistic boy king who undermined Lannister authority with every whim. Cersei's paranoia and growing resentment of her father further destabilized the court. Without a major victory to rally behind, the Lannister hold on the capital could begin to deteriorate. Plots would brew. Varys, always the spider, might begin whispering of alternative rulers. Littlefinger could shift allegiance to a more promising house. The small council, already a web of competing ambitions, would turn more cutthroat. The longer Robb survived, the more time Stannis had to rebuild. Stannis, the rightful heir in the eyes of many, still commanded loyalty from parts of the Stormlands, and had the backing of Melisandre's fiery faith. In canon, his position was greatly weakened by Blackwater Bay, but in a drawn-out war, especially with the Iron Bank potentially offering support, he could become a renewed threat. Tywin would find himself between two kings, Robb in the north and Stannis in the east, with no Red Wedding to offer him relief. Even Jaime Lannister's return would be less helpful than Tywin might hope. If this alternate timeline still includes Jaime losing his hand, he returns physically diminished and emotionally transformed. His loyalty to Cersei begins to waver. His admiration for Brienne opens him to new values. He questions the cost of Lannister power. Tywin, who expected a hardened, obedient heir, finds instead a man no longer interested in playing the game as he designed it. The rift between father and son would widen. Jaime might refuse key commands or even sabotage Tywin's long-term plans by acting on principle rather than political expediency. All of this comes before considering external threats. Across the Narrow Sea, Daenerys Targaryen is gathering momentum. Her dragons are growing, her army is growing, her legend is growing. The longer Westeros remains at war, the more vulnerable it becomes to her inevitable invasion. Tywin, who saw Daenerys as a distant nuisance, would come to regret his short-sightedness if she lands amid the chaos of unresolved civil war. Without the Red Wedding's resolution, Westeros remains fractured, and Daenerys arrives not as an invader, but as a savior to a realm sick of war. In the end, the Red Wedding wasn't just a slaughter, it was Tywin's masterstroke. It bought him time, saved his house, and delivered a chilling message: loyalty is worthless, and fear wins wars. Without it, Tywin is left playing a game with no shortcuts, no secret betrayals, and no clear path to victory. The war becomes longer, bloodier, and far more unpredictable. And Tywin Lannister, master strategist and ruthless pragmatist, must face the reality that even the best-laid plans can unravel when your enemies refuse to die. In the Game of Thrones timeline as we know it, Stannis Baratheon stands as one of the most polarizing figures in Westeros. A lawful claimant to the Iron Throne, a rigid commander, and a man driven by grim prophecy and unyielding duty. His downfall in the canon timeline is as tragic as it is inevitable, culminating in the failed march on Winterfell and the sacrifice of his daughter. But a key element that shaped his downfall was the weakened, fractured state of the North, brought on of course by the Red Wedding. Without that catastrophe, the political geography of Westeros would look very different. Robb Stark lives, the northern banners remain united, and most importantly, the possibility of a northern alliance with Stannis Baratheon is not only plausible, it may be the most strategically sound move for both sides. To understand the implications of such an alliance, we first need to look at the core motivations and principles of both Robb Stark and Stannis Baratheon. Though they are ideologically distinct, Robb is beloved and charismatic, while Stannis is cold and uncompromising. Both are bound by a strong sense of justice and a commitment to their respective causes. Robb fights to secure independence for the North and avenge his father's unjust death. Stannis, meanwhile, fights because he believes he is the rightful king by law, by blood, and eventually by prophecy. In the canon timeline, these two leaders never join forces. Robb dies before the opportunity ever arises, and the North devolves into chaos under the Boltons, setting the stage for Stannis' disastrous campaign. But in a world where Robb survives the Red Wedding, consolidates power in the North and Riverlands, and continues his war against the Lannisters, both Robb and Stannis face a common enemy, House Lannister. This shared goal creates a natural point of convergence. Initially, an alliance might not seem obvious. Robb had declared himself king in the North, and Stannis saw himself as the one true king of Westeros. On paper, this puts them at odds, one seeking secession, the other total rule. However, both men are pragmatic when it comes to military realities. Robb knew his forces couldn't fight a war on multiple fronts forever. Stannis, after his defeat at Blackwater, knew he would need allies beyond the reach of Dragonstone and the Stormlands. The North's military might, if intact, would be an attractive prize, and Robb, facing increasing pressure from the Lannisters, might recognize that an alliance with Stannis could tilt the balance of the entire war. Catelyn Stark, in this alternate timeline, would likely be the key to brokering such an alliance. She already expressed a certain degree of respect for Stannis, and as Robb's mother and chief advisor, she might urge a diplomatic outreach to Dragonstone or the Wall, depending on Stannis' position at the time. Melisandre's growing influence over Stannis complicates things, but not prohibitively. While the Northern Lords would undoubtedly be wary of Ronclor's Red Priests, The cultural and spiritual bond of their mutual respect for law and oaths might override religious concerns in the short term. A formal alliance between Robb and Stannis could take several forms. The most politically potent might be a mutual recognition treaty. Stannis acknowledges the independence of the North under House Stark, while Robb acknowledges Stannis as the rightful ruler of the southern kingdoms. This would allow each man to pursue his aims without stepping on the other's ambitions. It would also present a united front against the Lannisters, one that could sway neutral lords like those in the Vale or Dorne to reconsider their positions. Militarily, the benefits of such an alliance are immense. Robb commands battle-hardened troops from the north and riverlands. Stannis, though wounded from Blackwater, still commands the loyalty of many Stormlanders and has access to Dragonstone's formidable fleet. Combined, their forces could launch a two-pronged assault on Lannister strongholds. Stannis could march from the east, possibly reclaiming the Stormlands and threatening King's Landing again. Robb, meanwhile, could apply pressure from the west and north, possibly taking Lannisport or cutting off the Westerlands from King's Landing. Moreover, this alliance would dramatically alter the dynamics at the Wall. In the canon timeline, Stannis rides to the aid of the Night's Watch at the Battle of Castle Black, helping to repel Mance Rayder and the Wildling invasion. But what if, with Robb alive and the northern military infrastructure intact, this act had been a joint operation? Imagine Stannis arriving at the Wall, not alone, but alongside a contingent of Stark soldiers, sent north by Robb to aid Jon Snow and protect the realm from the growing supernatural threat. This united northern Baratheon force would be far more effective, and might allow for earlier coordination against the White Walkers. The implications for Jon Snow's role in this alternate future are fascinating. In the canon story, Stannis offers to legitimize Jon as Jon Stark, Warden of the North, in exchange for his loyalty. Jon refuses out of duty to the Night's Watch. But in this new timeline, if Robb is alive and still king in the North, the offer might not even be made, or it might be Robb himself who offers Jon a place in the family he never truly left. Jon, backed by his brother and respected by Stannis, could become the North's key envoy to the Wall, overseeing its defense while bridging the gap between mundane politics and mystical threats. Now consider the moral tension that such an alliance might create. Robb, deeply honorable like his father, would be uncomfortable with some of Stannis' methods, especially Melisandre's dark magic and the burning of heretics. If the alliance became strained, it might be over acts such as the sacrifice of non-believers or executions of nobles who refuse to bend the knee. Northern lords, fiercely loyal to the old gods, would bristle at R'hllor's encroachment. Robb would be forced to navigate the fine line between unity and independence, compromise and conviction. If he faltered, the alliance could fracture and plunge Westeros back into fragmented warfare. But if Robb and Stannis found a working partnership, one of mutual respect and clear boundaries, they could reshape the entire landscape of the war. House Lannister, deprived of the Red Wedding's easy victory, would be caught in a pincer of legitimate royal authority and northern independence. Tywin's strategies would unravel faster, and Cersei's grip on King's Landing might falter. A victorious Robb-Stannis coalition might even march on the capital itself, sweeping away the remains of Joffrey's corrupt reign and re-establishing rule by justice rather than fear. And what of the post-war settlement? In a best-case scenario, Stannis assumes the Iron Throne as the last rightful Baratheon, while Robb returns to the North as a recognized sovereign or High Lord under special status. The North retains its independence in all but name, while the southern kingdoms stabilize under Stannis' austere rule. The Night's Watch is reinforced, the Riverlands are restored, and the realm for once breathes. Alternatively, if Robb eventually falls, perhaps in battle or by assassination, Stannis may absorb the North into his kingdom, appointing Jon Snow or Sansa as warden to maintain stability. This would keep the peace, though it would mark the end of Robb's dream of a free North. On the darker side of this alternate history, the alliance might implode if Melisandre's influence grows too strong, if Robb refuses to acknowledge Stannis as king, or if religious tensions erupt into violence. Then civil war between the two factions becomes inevitable. The war, once focused on the Lannisters, becomes a new contest of legitimacy and ideology. The realm again fractures. Ultimately, the survival of Robb Stark in a post-Red Wedding world introduces a new player into Stannis' war plan, a player with the resources, motivation, and moral authority to either lift him to the throne or stand in his way. Whether they fight as allies or rivals, their intersection would mark one of the most pivotal chapters in Westeros' history. Together, they could have saved the realm. Apart, they might doom it again to fire and blood. In the world of Westeros, the wall stands not only as a physical barrier between civilization and the unknown, but also as a spiritual frontier, separating the forgotten, the forsaken, and the fallen from the political games of the realm. Among those cast into its cold embrace is Jon Snow, the bastard son of Eddard Stark, whose destiny would grow to shape the very survival of the realm. But in the canon timeline, Jon's journey unfolds in the shadow of loss. His father is executed, his half-brother Robb is slain at the Red Wedding, and House Stark is scattered to the winds. It is in this crucible of grief that Jon rises as Lord Commander and eventually as the reluctant hero of the Long Night. But what if the Red Wedding never happened? What if Robb Stark had survived and continued his campaign with the North and Riverlands united? How would Jon's fate and the fate of the Night's Watch have been transformed? To begin answering that question, we must consider Jon's state before the Red Wedding. He joins the Night's Watch to find purpose as a Stark outcast, driven by honor and the example of his father. His early days at Castle Black are marked by camaraderie, disillusionment, and growing awareness of the Watch's deteriorating condition. But beyond his duties, Jon remains emotionally tied to his family. He grieves Ned's death deeply. He yearns for connection with Robb, the brother who was always more than a sibling, a symbol of everything Jon thought he could never be. In the canon timeline, Jon receives word of Robb's death shortly after the Red Wedding, and it devastates him. It's one of the final blows that cuts his last tether to his family, leaving him alone in the North, surrounded by enemies and the undead. But in this alternate timeline, that moment of heartbreak never comes. Robb lives. House Stark remains intact. And Jon, though still bound by his vows, lives in a world where hope persists. This changes everything. With Robb alive and leading a victorious campaign in the South, the North stands strong, and Jon is no longer a forgotten bastard clinging to a crumbling institution. He is now the brother of a reigning king, a king who might one day choose to elevate him, legitimize him, or call upon him in times of need. That possibility alone changes Jon's perception of his future. The wall would still be his duty, but it would not feel like a life sentence. It would feel like a watchtower in service to something greater. Additionally, Robb's survival would significantly alter the politics surrounding the Night's Watch. In the original timeline, the Watch receives minimal support from the realm, its numbers dwindling, its castles abandoned. But with House Stark still in power and Northern unity intact, the Wall could once again receive the resources and attention it deserves. Robb, having been raised on tales of the Night's Watch, would understand its importance, especially if Jon sends warning of the gathering wildling host, or worse, the White Walkers. Instead of the Watch standing alone, they might have the full backing of the North behind them. This support would be both material and symbolic. Supplies could be sent from Winterfell, reinforcements could be drawn from northern houses. Jon might be seen not just as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, but as the de facto Stark presence at the Wall, a trusted guardian who bridges the world of sworn brothers and noble blood. The Watch's morale would improve, recruitment might even rise, and with a united North watching, figures like Alliser Thorne and Jon O'Slint would have far less power to undermine Jon's leadership. Now let us consider Jon's journey among the wildlings. In both timelines, Jon infiltrates Mance Rayder's army and grows close to Ygritte, challenging his loyalties and reshaping his worldview. That would remain unchanged. But the context in which Jon returns to Castle Black would be drastically different. In the canon timeline, he returns to find the North in chaos, Winterfell burned, and the Stark name desecrated by traitors. His heart is hardened, and his choices more desperate. But if Robb still lives and Winterfell still stands, perhaps even ruled by a regent like Catelyn or another Stark loyalist, Jon's return becomes a reunion with a realm that still remembers him. When the wildlings assault the Wall, Robb may even send reinforcements to aid the Watch. Imagine northern bannermen fighting alongside black-cloaked brothers to repel the Freefolk, Tormund Giantsbane clashing with House Umber warriors, direwolves and ravens standing side by side against a common threat. This alliance between the Watch and the North would also change the political implications of Jon's rise to Lord Commander. In the canon timeline, his election is narrow and contentious, won in part by Samwell Tarly's clever maneuvering. But in this alternate timeline, with the Stark name still powerful, Jon's reputation is vastly different. He is no longer the last trace of a lost house. He is the living link to a reigning king. That alone might sway votes among the Night's Watch, not out of favoritism, but out of respect for his leadership and connections. Jon would likely be elected Lord Commander, with overwhelming support. And what of Jon's relationship with Stannis Baratheon? In the original timeline, Stannis arrives at the Wall after his defeat at Blackwater, offering Jon legitimacy as a Stark in exchange for his loyalty. The offer is a major temptation, but Jon refuses, choosing duty over family, the Watch over the North. But in this alternate world, Stannis' offer might not come, or if it does, it would come under entirely different circumstances. If Robb is still king in the North, then any such offer of legitimization would be Robb's to make, not Stannis's. Jon's choice would not be a betrayal of his vows, but a matter of family. Alternatively, if Robb and Stannis have formed an alliance, as explored in Section 10, then Jon may serve as a critical bridge between them. His loyalty to both men could foster trust. His knowledge of the threat beyond the Wall could galvanize their combined forces. In such a case, Jon's leadership might extend beyond the Watch. He might be called upon to lead the defense of the realm, not just the Wall. Let's also explore the emotional ramifications of this altered timeline. Jon's internal struggle with identity, bastard, Stark, Watchman, Wildling, would still exist, but it would be tempered by a family that is still alive and intact. Robb could write to him. Arya could be searching for him. Sansa might hope for his return. The loneliness that defined so much of Jon's canon journey would be lifted, if not erased. His decisions would no longer be made in the void of grief, but in the light of hope. Would Jon still be stabbed by his brothers at Castle Black? That's a crucial question. In the canon timeline, his assassination is driven by resentment of his alliance with the Wildlings and fear of his growing power. But with Robb alive and the North allied with the Watch, the political calculus changes. Jon's decision to allow the Wildlings south of the Wall may still spark tension, but he would have powerful allies to back him. His enemies would think twice before murdering the brother of the king in the North. Alternatively, if he were attacked, northern reinforcements might arrive in time to save him or avenge him. And what of his resurrection by Melisandre? If Jon is never killed, then that resurrection may never happen or may be unnecessary. Alternatively, if he does die and is brought back, the presence of Robb and the unified North changes how his return is perceived. He would not return to a broken kingdom, but to a waiting family. His second life might begin not in exile, but in renewed purpose. Perhaps he becomes the general of the combined forces of the Watch and the North against the White Walkers. Perhaps he finally takes his place not as king in the North, but as its greatest defender. There is also the lingering question of Jon's true parentage. In the canon timeline, the truth of his birth, Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark's son, is a revelation that rocks the foundations of Westeros. But in this alternate timeline, with Robb alive and the Stark network more intact, the truth might emerge earlier. How would Robb react to discovering Jon is his cousin, not his brother? Would it matter? Would it change Jon's claim to the North, or even to the Iron Throne? Perhaps the Northern Alliance, strengthened by this revelation, becomes the nucleus of a new Targaryen-Stark dynasty. Ultimately, in a world where the Red Wedding never happens, Jon Snow is no longer the forgotten bastard at the end of the world. He is the Watchman with a kingdom behind him, a brother to a living king, a potential heir to more than he ever imagined. And when the White Walkers come, as they inevitably do, it is not a fractured realm they face, but a unified North, led by the sword in the dark, the Watcher on the walls, Jon Snow. Daenerys Targaryen's campaign to reclaim the Iron Throne is a slow-burning epic, one that unfolds far from Westeros, across the cities of Slavers Bay. There, she grows from an exiled princess to a liberator queen, earning armies, dragons, and political acumen before finally turning her gaze west. But in the original timeline, she returns to a fractured realm. The Starks are dead or scattered, the Lannisters hold power, and Westeros is divided by years of civil war. This fractured landscape plays perfectly into her hands. However, if the Red Wedding never happened, if Robb Stark survived, and the North remained strong, Daenerys would return to a Westeros that is far less chaotic and far more complicated. The political chessboard would be changed entirely, altering her invasion, her allies, her legitimacy, and perhaps even her fate. To understand the implications, let's first examine Daenerys' motivations and timing. By the time she has established herself in Meereen, Daenerys has amassed a formidable force, the Unsullied, a loyal host of freedmen, and 3 growing dragons. But despite her strength, she does not rush into Westeros. Instead, she lingers in Essos, attempting to prove that she can rule, not just conquer. This delay gives Westeros time to sort its own conflicts. In the canon timeline, those conflicts produce a broken realm. Tywin is dead, Joffrey is poisoned, Cersei is spiraling, and the North is in ruins. But in the alternate timeline where the Red Wedding never happened, This extra time allows Robb Stark to consolidate power, the northern cause to stabilize, and the political geography of the Seven Kingdoms to resist easy conquest. Let us first consider the immediate ramifications of a surviving Robb Stark. With the young wolf continuing his campaign, the North and Riverlands likely become a de facto independent kingdom, even if formal recognition is never granted. Whether he defeats the Lannisters outright, or simply grinds the war into a stalemate, Robb commands legitimacy in the North, and loyalty among his bannermen. If he is victorious, he may have even pushed Tywin back into the Westerlands, weakening the Lannister grip on the Iron Throne. At the very least, the Lannisters are no longer unchallenged rulers of the realm. This significantly alters Daenerys' target. In the original timeline, the Lannisters are the primary villains of Westeros. They are ruthless, tyrannical, and despised by much of the realm. When Daenerys returns, it is easy for her to position herself as the savior, breaking the wheel of corruption and restoring justice. But in a world where Robb Stark still lives, and the Starks remain beloved symbols of honor and northern pride, Daenerys is no longer the sole breaker of chains. She would be arriving not to liberate a tyrannized kingdom, but to insert herself into a realm that has already begun to heal, or at least restructure. The political ramifications are immense. Robb Stark is no friend of the Lannisters, but he is also not likely to accept a foreign queen with dragons descending from across the sea. His loyalty is to the north, and while he may respect Daenerys' claim as a Targaryen, he would almost certainly reject the idea of bending the knee. The North fought hard for its independence. Its people bled for it. Whether under Robb, Jon, or Sansa, they are unlikely to relinquish it easily. Daenerys would face the same resistance that the Targaryens once met during Aegon's original conquest. Only now, she arrives as an outsider among multiple power players, not as a singular unifying force. Would Robb and Daenerys clash? It depends on the timing and their respective temperaments. If Robb survives long enough to see Daenerys' dragons and armies arrive, he might perceive her as a threat to the fragile peace he has built, or as a powerful figure whose goals could be aligned with his, at least temporarily. A Northern Targaryen alliance is not out of the question, but it would require immense diplomacy. Robb would demand northern independence. Daenerys, who believes the Seven Kingdoms are her birthright, might refuse. The standoff would likely define their early relationship, two young rulers, both idealistic and principled, locked in a tense negotiation that could tip into war. Now consider the matter of allies. In the canon timeline, Daenerys gains crucial support from Tyrion Lannister, Varys, Olenna Tyrell, and the Martells. These alliances are facilitated by the Lannisters' increasing unpopularity. But in this new timeline, Tywin Lannister may still be alive, and the Lannisters may not have suffered the same internal collapse. If the war with Robb continues, or has reached a ceasefire, the Lannisters may still control King's Landing with military strength, even if their grip has weakened. This could make allies more cautious. The Tyrells, for example, may be less inclined to betray the Iron Throne if it hasn't fallen into Cersei's madness. Olenna Tyrell may still desire vengeance for Joffrey's crimes, or seek to free Margaery from the Lannisters' grip, but if Robb Stark is applying pressure from the north, she may be more inclined to ally with him than with a distant Targaryen queen she has never met. In fact, Robb's charisma and shared enemy in the Lannisters might make him a more appealing ally to the Reach than Daenerys ever could be. Similarly, Dorne's Martells, who joined Daenerys in the canon out of a shared hatred for the Lannisters, might instead turn to the Starks. Catelyn's connection to the Tullys and her diplomatic acumen, assuming she survives, could create pathways to Dorne that are independent of Targaryen influence. If Robb and the Martells align, Daenerys may find herself landing on a continent where the North, Dorne, and the Reach have already formed a new order, one that has no room for a conquering queen. Alternatively, Daenerys may attempt to forge an alliance with the North itself through marriage. If Robb is alive and unmarried, or if Jon Snow has been legitimized, Daenerys might see an opportunity to unite their houses. The political benefits are immense, dragons in the north and ancient legitimacy in the south. But this would depend heavily on personalities, timing, and trust. Robb may not want to trade his hard-won independence for a royal marriage. Jon, if offered, might accept, but only if he believes in Daenerys' vision, and in this timeline, without the shared hardship of the original canon, that trust may not be easy to earn. The dragons themselves are also a wild card. In the canon timeline, they are a symbol of dominance, unmatched by any other force in Westeros. But in this alternate version, Robb commands a united North with deep loyalty, well-trained forces, and home field advantage. A dragon cannot hold a castle forever, and fire alone does not win hearts. If Daenerys uses her dragons to threaten or burn the North, she risks alienating the very people she claims to want to rule. Robb, raised on tales of the last Targaryens and their fiery tyranny, might react defensively. The legacy of the Mad King would still linger, making every move Daenerys makes subject to intense scrutiny. The White Walkers and the Long Night remain the greatest existential threat to Westeros, and they offer the greatest opportunity for unity. If Jon Snow is still Lord Commander, and Robb is king in the north, the warning about the undead might reach Daenerys earlier. Instead of invading with conquest in mind, she might be persuaded to redirect her forces north to fight the true enemy. In this version, the alliance between Jon and Daenerys could form on more diplomatic terms, perhaps with Robb acting as a mediator rather than a fallen memory. If Daenerys aids in the fight against the Night King with the north intact and leading the defense, she would gain legitimacy not through dragons or bloodlines, but through action. She would be seen not as a conqueror, but as a savior. The north might not bow, but they may welcome her as a hero and equal, and that would be a legacy more powerful than any throne. But if the invasion turns hostile, if Daenerys seeks to burn her way to the throne, to force northern submission, to break the wheel without understanding what the north has built, then she risks repeating the cycle she vowed to end. Robb would resist, the north would fight, the realm would fracture anew, and the Queen of Dragons might find herself alone once more, feared and resented, not loved and followed. In the end, Daenerys Targaryen's invasion of Westeros, in a world where the Red Wedding never occurred, is not an easy triumph. It is a diplomatic labyrinth, a moral test, and a strategic gamble. The North stands tall, the Starks are not broken, and the realm is not so eager to be saved. If Daenerys adapts, choosing cooperation over conquest, she may forge a lasting peace. But if she repeats the fire and blood of her ancestors, she may find that the North remembers and resists. Tyrion Lannister is one of the most complex and beloved characters in Game of Thrones. A man of wit, intellect, and deeply buried wounds, constantly navigating the dangerous terrain of a world that hates him for who he is. In the canonical timeline, his rise and fall are inextricably linked to the collapse of House Stark. The Red Wedding cements Lannister dominance, frees Tywin from military pressure, and allows Tyrion to momentarily enjoy security and influence within King's Landing. But it is a false peace, one that soon implodes under the weight of Lannister treachery, Tyrion's murder of his father, and the unraveling of his place in the world. But if the Red Wedding never happens, if Robb Stark survives, House Stark remains a strong political force, and the North holds fast against Lannister aggression, then Tyrion's journey unfolds on a vastly different trajectory. Without the destruction of the Starks to bolster Lannister power, the court in King's Landing becomes more fragile, alliances more uncertain, and Tyrion's position more perilous. In this section, we explore how Tyrion's fate might evolve in a Westeros, where House Stark is not extinguished, but ascendant. Let's begin with Tyrion's immediate context in the timeline surrounding the Red Wedding. Tyrion had just survived the Battle of Blackwater Bay, where he personally led the defense of King's Landing against Stannis Baratheon. Despite his heroism, he receives no true credit. Instead, Tywin Lannister arrives, takes all the glory, and immediately begins to marginalize Tyrion. Stripped of his position as Hand of the King, Tyrion is married off to Sansa Stark, a political move designed to claim the North through inheritance, should the Stark line be extinguished. In the canonical world, the Red Wedding makes this marriage diabolically brilliant. With Robb, Catelyn, and many key northern leaders dead, the Lannisters plan to use Sansa as a puppet, her claim to Winterfell funneled through Tyrion, thus granting the Lannisters theoretical dominion over the North. But in a world where Robb survives, and the North is neither conquered nor broken, this plan becomes meaningless. Sansa remains married to Tyrion, yes, but her brother is alive, her family not wiped from existence, and the Northern Lords remain loyal to the Starks. Tyrion suddenly finds himself married to the sister of the king in the North, not a powerless orphan. This puts him in a deeply awkward position. On one hand, it ties him to a powerful family that is currently at war with his own. On the other, it makes him a potential diplomatic bridge between the Lannisters and Starks, if anyone is willing to trust him. The irony, of course, is that Tyrion likely would not want to exploit Sansa's claim. In the show, he treats her with unexpected kindness and respect, despite the circumstances. He protects her, consoles her, and shows no interest in using her for political gain. In this alternate reality, that kindness could bear fruit. If Robb survives and eventually negotiates peace or a ceasefire with King's Landing, Tyrion could become the Lannister envoy in those discussions, his marriage to Sansa giving him just enough legitimacy to sit at the table, while his reputation as the black sheep of the Lannister family makes him less threatening than Tywin or Cersei. This diplomatic role could become Tyrion's redemption arc far earlier than in the canonical storyline. Rather than being falsely accused of Joffrey's murder, imprisoned, and eventually forced to flee Westeros after killing his father, Tyrion might instead become the one Lannister voice that seeks peace. He could propose solutions that satisfy both sides: southern recognition of northern independence, a marriage alliance between houses, or joint stewardship of contested territories like the Riverlands. But this path is far from guaranteed. Tywin Lannister remains a towering figure, and he would not be pleased to see his son potentially aligning with the Starks, even indirectly. In the canonical timeline, Tywin tolerates Tyrion only because he is useful. Without the military triumph of the Red Wedding, Tywin is under far greater pressure. His war with the North continues, his hold on the realm is less secure, and his legacy is at risk. This makes him more paranoid, more authoritarian, and more likely to turn on Tyrion, especially if he suspects his youngest son of favoring the enemy. This could lead to an even earlier rift between Tyrion and his family. If Tywin threatens Tyrion's life or reputation, or attempts to annul his marriage to Sansa, Tyrion might flee King's Landing preemptively. But instead of escaping to Essos as he does in the canon, Tyrion may seek asylum with the very people his family tried to destroy, the Starks. Imagine the drama. Tyrion Lannister, son of Tywin, showing up at Riverrun or Winterfell, asking for sanctuary from the north. Sansa, still married to him, may argue on his behalf. Robb, cautious but just, may allow him to stay, especially if Tyrion brings valuable intelligence about Lannister plans, supply lines, or the political fractures in King's Landing. In doing so, Tyrion begins the slow process of atoning for his house's crimes, not through vengeance, but through service. In this version of the timeline, Tyrion could become one of Robb Stark's most unexpected and valuable advisors. Tsunade lacks the political finesse of his father and mother. Tyrion could help fill that gap. His understanding of King's Landing politics, his pragmatic worldview, and his deep knowledge of Westerosi history and law could help Robb navigate alliances, avoid traps, and even prepare for Daenerys Targaryen's eventual arrival. Speaking of Daenerys, what happens when she finally does arrive? In the canon timeline, Tyrion becomes one of Daenerys' most trusted advisors after fleeing to Essos and falling in with Varys and Illyrio. But in this alternate world, if Tyrion never flees Westeros, his path to her court may be delayed, or completely different. Perhaps he still ends up in Essos, especially if Tywin eventually wins out and forces him into exile. Or perhaps Daenerys lands in Westeros, while Tyrion is in the north, and he becomes one of the key figures trying to broker peace between the Dragon Queen and the King in the north. This would be a compelling role for Tyrion, mediator between fire and ice. His ability to see both the flaws and virtues in rulers would make him uniquely suited to temper Daenerys' fiery idealism with the northern sense of honor and pragmatism. He could argue for restraint, for compromise, and perhaps even for unity. Of course, none of this erases Tyrion's internal demons. Even without being accused of regicide, he would still live under the shadow of his father's hatred, his sister's scorn, and the guilt that he carries for his past. His relationship with Shae, for example, might still unravel, especially if she feels threatened by his marriage to Sansa or his deeper entanglement in politics. Tyrion's loneliness and self-loathing would still haunt him, but in this version of events, he might find a new sense of identity earlier. Not as a Lannister, not as the Imp, but as something else, a man who helped heal a broken realm. Alternatively, the worst could still happen. If Tyrion remains in King's Landing and tensions with Tywin and Cersei escalate, he may still be accused of Joffrey's murder, especially if the wedding feast still turns into a massacre, as it does in the original timeline. In that case, Tyrion's fate might echo canon, but the difference is, with Robb Stark alive and Sansa possibly under his protection, Tyrion might have allies this time. His trial might go differently. His escape might be cleaner, and his journey to Daenerys might come not as a fugitive, but as a free man seeking purpose. In the end, Tyrion's fate without the Red Wedding hinges on a single question: is he allowed to evolve, or is he forced to run? In this alternate world, the odds of evolution are far greater, with the North standing strong, the Lannisters under pressure, and the realm still balancing between war and diplomacy. Tyrion may find his moment, not in betrayal, but in redemption. He may become a peacemaker, a strategist, a husband, a friend, and for a man who spent so much of his life being underestimated, that future would be the greatest revenge of all. In the canonical Game of Thrones timeline, Bran Stark undergoes one of the most mystifying and metaphysical journeys in the entire series. transforming from the paralyzed son of a noble house into the near-omniscient three-eyed raven, a living vessel of Westerosi history and prophecy. But that path is carved out of trauma. The fall of Winterfell, the apparent deaths of his brothers, the destruction of House Stark's political power, and the Red Wedding all sever Bran from the world of men and force him into the realm of gods and ghosts. His journey north beyond the Wall becomes not only a physical voyage, but a symbolic severance from his humanity. But what if the Red Wedding never occurred? What if Robb Stark lived, Catelyn survived, and the North remained strong? Would Bran's destiny still take him beyond the Wall? Would he still become the three-eyed raven? Or would a world where the Stark family endures reshape Bran's future, perhaps toward a different kind of power, one grounded not in ancient magic, but in human memory, rulership, and legacy? To begin answering that question, we must recall Bran's condition prior to the Red Wedding. Crippled from his fall at Winterfell's tower, pushed by Jaime Lannister after witnessing a forbidden encounter, Bran's early arc is one of physical loss and spiritual awakening. As he journeys northward with Hodor, Mira, and Jojen Reed, he begins to experience prophetic dreams, skin-changing abilities, and glimpses of a greater purpose. The canon Bran is a boy orphaned not only by physical distance, but by a collapsing world. He believes his family is dead, his home is lost, and that he must seek answers beyond the Wall, because nothing remains for him in the world he once knew. But in an alternate timeline where the Red Wedding never happens, and Robb Stark's campaign survives, Bran's motivations are altered dramatically. First and foremost, he no longer believes his family has been annihilated. Though he may still be in hiding after Theon Greyjoy's seizure of Winterfell, he could receive word through the northern grapevine that Robb is alive and fighting for their cause. This alone changes Bran's emotional state. He is no longer a lost heir wandering in exile. He is the younger brother of a king, a living Stark whose name still holds power. His decision-making would be less shaped by despair and more guided by responsibility. Let's explore what might happen if Bran, instead of traveling beyond the Wall, returns to the Stark fold. In the original timeline, Bran's return to the political world of Westeros is delayed until the final seasons, after he has completed his training with the three-eyed raven. He returns as a different person entirely. Distant and otherworldly, more oracle than man. But if Robb lives and the North remains under Stark control, or eventually restored under his banner, Bran might never need to leave the realm of men at all. He could be escorted back to Winterfell, or Riverrun, under the protection of loyal bannermen like the Reeds or the Blackfish. There his dreams and visions might be nurtured rather than accelerated by trauma. Imagine Bran at Robb's war council. His growing green sight could be used not just to observe history or the movements of the White Walkers, but to warn Robb of betrayal, strategic mistakes, or potential alliances. With Jojen still at his side, Bran might serve as a sort of mystical advisor, quiet and cryptic but valued. While Robb may not fully understand the scope of his brother's abilities, he would certainly recognize their potential, especially if Bran predicted key battlefield outcomes or exposed treachery before it happened. Furthermore, with Catelyn alive and guiding Robb, Bran's mystical evolution might have been slowed. His mother, deeply protective and suspicious of magic, as she was with Jon Snow's direwolf, might discourage his growing fascination with ancient powers. Instead, she could guide him toward healing, education, and perhaps even a new role within Northern leadership. His paralysis would prevent him from becoming a knight, but not a maester, scholar, or even Lord of Winterfell, should Robb remain childless or fall in battle. But let us not ignore Bran's dreams. In both the books and the show, Bran's visions are not simply metaphorical, they are direct messages from the past, the present, and the mysterious forces beyond the Wall. Even in this alternate timeline, Bran would continue to dream of a great weirwood tree, of the raven with 3 eyes, of winter's approach, and it's likely that eventually he would feel called to seek out the source of these visions, but perhaps he would not go alone and forsaken. Perhaps Robb, recognizing the importance of Bran's journey, would send guards, supplies, and even scholars to accompany him. Such a journey could occur under the Stark banner, not as a desperate flight, but as a sanctioned expedition, the North's search for the old powers. In this version, Bran's quest beyond the Wall becomes less a flight into exile and more a heroic pilgrimage. This matters because it means Bran remains emotionally grounded. He is not severed from his identity. He does not have to shed his name, his emotions, or his family to become something ancient and unknowable. He can retain his humanity. If Bran still reaches the cave of the three-eyed raven, his training might unfold more slowly and more safely. Perhaps Robb or Maester Lewin, if still alive or replaced by another trusted northern maester, sends messages to the Night's Watch or nearby clans to monitor Bran's path. Perhaps Mira and Jojen receive reinforcements. The journey is still dangerous, cold, wild, and filled with death. But Bran's status as the living heir of Winterfell offers protections that canonical Bran never had. Now imagine Bran returning from his mystical training, whether partial or complete, to a north that has not fallen. Winterfell stands. Robb rules, or has passed command to another Stark. Bran, now more confident in his visions, returns not as a stranger, but as a prophet of the coming storm. His warnings about the White Walkers, the Night King, and the Long Night might be taken more seriously this time. He is not a quiet boy speaking in riddles, he is the brother of the king, a known quantity. His insight is valued. The North prepares. Crucially, Bran might also reveal Jon Snow's true heritage earlier in this timeline. With Robb alive, and possibly in contact with Howland Reed, the secret of Jon's parentage, Rhaegar and Lyanna, might emerge in a more controlled, deliberate manner. Instead of a dramatic late-series reveal, this knowledge could shape strategy. Jon may be legitimized by Robb and used as a bridge between the North and Daenerys Targaryen. The political consequences are immense. The war against the White Walkers could be led not by fractured coalitions, but by a unified realm with Jon, Robb, and Bran each playing a vital role. There is, however, another possibility. Bran never becomes the three-eyed raven at all. If the war takes priority and Bran's abilities are subdued or mistrusted, his path may remain largely unexplored. He may grow into a different kind of figure altogether. A keeper of ancient lore, perhaps, or a northern seer in the tradition of the old gods, but not the all-seeing, emotionless being he becomes in canon. He might grow old as a Stark who sees the world differently, but still chooses to live among it. But if he does become the three-eyed raven, even in a world where Robb lives, the circumstances of that transformation would be very different. He would not lose his identity as a Stark. He would not be forced to abandon love, family, and home. Instead, he might retain a dual existence, both Bran and the Raven, human and mystical, past and present. He might use his powers not to become king, as in the show's controversial finale, but to ensure his family, and all of Westeros, survives what lies beyond the wall. In the end, the Red Wedding was not just a massacre of bodies, it was a massacre of potential futures. One of those futures was Bran Stark's. The destruction of his family forced him to abandon the human world and embrace the spiritual one entirely. But if that betrayal never occurred, if Robb lived, if Winterfell stood, if the wolves remained a pack, then Bran might not have had to become something inhuman to serve his purpose. He could have remained Bran, the boy who fell, the seer who rose again, not alone, but surrounded by those who loved him, a new kind of three-eyed raven. One who remembers not just every moment in history, but what it means to be part of it. The War of the Five Kings was the central maelstrom that tore Westeros apart in the wake of Robert Baratheon's death. A multi-front civil war waged by 5 rival claimants, each with a different vision of power, justice, and legitimacy. In the canonical timeline, the war ends not with a bang, but a slow collapse. Robb Stark is betrayed and murdered at the Red Wedding. Stannis Baratheon is repelled, then destroyed in a doomed northern campaign. Renly is assassinated by shadow magic. Balon Greyjoy is sidelined. Tommen Baratheon inherits the throne under Lannister Tyrell control, but the war leaves a realm weakened and vulnerable, opening the door to the greater threats of the White Walkers and Daenerys Targaryen. But what if the Red Wedding never happened? What if Robb Stark survived, and the northern forces remained intact? In this alternate timeline, the War of the Five Kings would take a dramatically different course. New alliances would form, old grudges would fester. The chessboard would remain crowded with powerful pieces, and no single king would have an easy path to victory. The war wouldn't simply be delayed, it would be rewritten. Robb Stark, the northern king that endured. At the heart of this revised war is Robb Stark. In canon, Robb was the war's most impressive field commander, winning every battle he fought but ultimately losing the war through political missteps and betrayal. With the Red Wedding erased from history, Robb remains a major player. His army is still strong. His claim as king in the north is backed by loyal bannermen, the Riverlands, and a cultural narrative of justice and vengeance. Without the Red Wedding, Robb could continue pressing the war on his terms, either pushing west into Lannister territory, or consolidating his hold on the Riverlands before negotiating peace from a position of strength. The psychological impact of his survival also cannot be overstated. The North would remain united. The legend of the young wolf would only grow. he would not just be a rebel, he would become a symbol of northern independence and resistance. Stannis Baratheon, a king in exile, a king reborn. Stannis Baratheon's trajectory is likewise dramatically altered. In canon, his power is shattered at the Battle of Blackwater Bay, and his path is redirected by Melisandre's prophecies toward the Wall and the threat of the White Walkers. But in this new timeline, he no longer operates in a political vacuum. Robb is alive, the North is whole, and the Lannisters are still at war. This gives Stannis more potential allies and more threats. Rather than retreating to the Wall immediately, Stannis may attempt to reach out to Robb in hopes of a formal alliance. Though both men claim kingship, they are united by their shared hatred of the Lannisters and their sense of justice. A pact between them would create a two-front war against King's Landing, Robb from the north and west, and Stannis from the east. This would put unprecedented pressure on Tywin Lannister's forces and force the Iron Throne to reconsider its claim of stability. Alternatively, if Robb refuses to bend the knee or acknowledge Stannis' supremacy, the two may become rivals, jockeying for legitimacy in the eyes of the realm. A three-way standoff between Robb, Stannis, and Tommen/Joffrey creates the potential for endless war, unless the real politic of Westeros drives them to compromise. Renly Baratheon, a ghost that still haunts. Renly Baratheon, the youngest Baratheon brother, dies early in the canonical war, assassinated by Melisandre's shadow magic. His death collapses his coalition of Reach and Stormlands bannermen, many of whom later support the Lannisters through the Tyrells. But in this alternate timeline, with the war extended and the stakes higher, Renly's death becomes more politically potent. If the Tyrells grow disillusioned with the Lannisters, as they might if the war drags on, or if Cersei proves unstable, they may attempt to elevate a new Renly figure, perhaps Garland or Loras, as a puppet king. The Tyrells, still immensely wealthy and powerful, may see a new opportunity in Robb Stark, or even Daenerys Targaryen, should she land in Westeros during the war. Renly's memory would be used as a rallying cry for southern houses, who dislike both the Lannisters and the rigid rule of Stannis. Balon Greyjoy, still an opportunistic threat. The Greyjoy rebellion remains a wild card in this revised war. In canon, Balon Greyjoy takes advantage of Robb's focus on the south to launch his own war in the north, seizing Moat Cailin and occupying Winterfell through Theon's betrayal. But with the north still united under Robb, and Winterfell possibly secured by loyal houses like the Manderleys or Umbers, Balon's attacks may be repelled earlier. The North may even launch a counter-invasion of the Iron Islands with the help of Riverland's forces and northern fleets from White Harbor. Balon's death and Euron's ascension may still happen, but in a different context, one where the Ironborn are not free to roam unchecked, and where northern retribution is swift and coordinated. The Iron Islands might even be forced into a second submission to the North or the Iron Throne, rather than enjoying the loose independence they had during the chaos of the canon timeline. The Lannisters, the lion-cornered. Perhaps no house is more affected by the continued strength of the Starks than House Lannister. In the original timeline, Tywin uses the Red Wedding to end the war with a single stroke. But without that betrayal, he is stuck in a costly, prolonged war against an enemy that refuses to fall. His coffers, already strained, begin to empty. The Iron Bank of Braavos grows restless. His alliances, particularly with the Tyrells, become fragile. Tywin may be forced to consider peace with the North, an option he detested in canon. Or worse, he may become so desperate that he turns to increasingly reckless tactics, perhaps even unleashing wildfire or authorizing extreme measures to hold territory. His death, which canonically occurs at the hands of Tyrion after Joffrey's poisoning, might happen later or differently, depending on whether Tyrion stays in King's Landing or defects to the north or Essos. Cersei and Joffrey, still volatile and impulsive, only make matters worse. With Robb alive and the North standing, Cersei's paranoia may spiral even faster. Her grip on power might erode earlier, leading to a faster implosion of Lannister authority in the capital. The High Sparrow, religious unrest, and the eventual rise of the Faith militant may still occur, but in a far less secure capital, surrounded by enemies on all sides. The role of the small folk and the realm at large. One of the key effects of the Red Wedding was psychological. It broke the realm's hope. Robb Stark was young, idealistic, and undefeated. His death and the betrayal that accompanied it taught the people that honor had no place in Westeros. Without the Red Wedding, that lesson is never delivered. Robb continues to represent a kind of hope, an alternative to the corruption of the Lannisters and the cold fire of Stannis. The small folk may rally behind his cause. Songs continue to be sung about the young wolf, and in taverns from the Neck to the Trident, whispers grow of a better king. This public sentiment could lead to increased defection from Lannister-allied houses. Minor lords in the Crownlands and the Riverlands might seek to swear fealty to Robb. If Stannis behaves too harshly or religiously, they may see Robb as the more moderate choice. In short, the realm becomes more politically fluid. No one ruler dominates, and the war becomes less about territory and more about identity. The Long Night and the Unseen Enemy. The most important change to the War of the Five Kings in this alternate timeline is that it may never truly end, not because of indecision, but because of what lies in the far north. The White Walkers, long forgotten by the world of men, are returning, and in this timeline they may arrive to find Westeros still locked in civil war. But this time, the North is ready. With Robb alive, Bran's visions heeded, Jon Snow supported, and the Night's Watch reinforced, the realms of men may unite sooner. If Robb allies with Stannis, Daenerys, or even legitimizes Jon, they may form a coalition far stronger than what we saw in the show's final seasons. The War of the Five Kings would give way to a new war, not of politics, but of survival. Not five kings, but five armies, five ideologies, five realms, standing against the coming dark. A different ending, a different legacy. In the original Game of Thrones, the War of the Five Kings ends in ambiguity. The realm is broken, the true enemy is forgotten, and the survivors limp toward the next war, weary and scattered. But in this alternate history where the Red Wedding never happens, the war is not simply delayed, it is transformed. Robb Stark's survival ripples across every house, every battlefield, every claim to the throne. The war becomes a crucible of choices, vengeance or justice, fire or frost, power or peace, and perhaps, just perhaps, with the North unbroken and the wolf still howling, Westeros might emerge not shattered, but remade.